There we go. All right, Wes, if you could, oh, what is it doing? Sorry. There we go.
All right, we're ready to get started?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, thank you all so much for letting me join your meeting today. I'm Westin Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy with Civic Nebraska. So my kind of role in this elections and voting rights effort we have is to focus primarily on senators and their staff as they work on elections and voting rights legislation. So I tell all the senators who will listen that they should think of me as a third staffer who works for free, but only on elections. So since we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, I can't write campaign checks like a lot of other lobbyists, but I can provide information, I can provide attention, and I can try to provide resources that they might not have time for otherwise. So I try my best to be kind of a go-to elections expert in the Capitol. Sometimes that means supporting senators, and unfortunately, sometimes that means opposing senators when they have legislation that would make our elections harder. Prepare these great slides. I will kind of walk through some of the highlight bills. And like she said, please interrupt at any point. I would love to answer any questions that you have. If I can't answer them, I'm happy to admit that, and I will follow up later with the answer if we can find it. So I will start with the classic Civic Nebraska elections issue, which is voter ID. Civic Nebraska has led the effort against voter ID since it was first introduced, which was in 2011. For those of you who don't know, the year it was first introduced, nobody knew what it was. So it seemed like, oh, common sense, ID, sure. So the bill actually failed by one vote. The story, I wasn't there, so I can't confirm, but the story is that then Senator Brad Ashford was the deciding vote on this issue. And it wasn't until Ann Ashford finally said, listen, you don't get to come home unless you vote no on this bill, that we finally defeated voter ID for the first time. And the momentum against it has just grown ever since. A lot of you are probably very familiar with this issue, but if you're not, I'll kind of give you the basic rundown of what it is and why it's a pretty bad idea, even if it might seem kind of unassuming at first. So the premise of voter ID is that when you cast a vote, you have to provide some kind of identification proving that you are you. Different states have different versions. The kind of major categories, there's kind of a quadrant of voter ID laws. We've got strict photo ID, which is the worst. So like Kansas, for example, if you're going to vote, you have to have a current identification with your current address and a photograph that a poll worker decides looks enough like you for you to be able to vote. So that's the toughest kind. There are some states that have what we call a non-strict photo ID. So they would take any ID as long as it's updated and has your photo. It doesn't have to be a driver's license or a state ID. Then there are some states that just require some kind of ID, but doesn't need to be a photograph. The supporters, of course, will tell you a story that our elections are under threat by people who are voting, who are pretending to be people that they aren't. This is, of course, we now know that this is a story that doesn't have very much evidence behind it. In Nebraska, there have been exactly 0 cases of what we call voter impersonation fraud, which is somebody voting pretending that they are someone else. The whole story behind voter ID is that if we can just present these identifications, then that's going to keep our elections safe, and we promise we can do it without causing an undue burden on Nebraska voters. We oppose voter ID for a lot of reasons, and I'll kind of give you the highlights. The first is going to be about the actual legislation itself. So you can see that the bill number for voter ID, LR3CA, is pretty different from most pieces of legislation. The legislation is usually LB number. LB stands for legislative bill. LR3CA means this is a legislative resolution, number 3, and then CA stands for constitutional amendment. So if the legislature were to pass LR3CA, there would be language that we put on the ballot, and Nebraska voters would decide, yes, we decide that you have to show a photo ID at the polls. But as most of you probably know, that is not the same as having a law. So if we amended the Constitution, the legislature the next year then has to pass a bill explaining how exactly that's going to work. But they will have to pass something because now the Constitution says so. So our most specific concern with LR3CA is that this is the broadest version of a voter ID proposal anyone could possibly write. So we hate the idea of senators signing on to a piece, not even a piece of legislation, to a resolution, committing them to a pretty controversial position without even knowing the specifics of that position. We oppose all forms of voter ID, but some states certainly have it worse than others. And so some senators who might be open to kind of a looser form of voter ID will be committing to the concept without knowing the specifics. In general, we are I think we're consistently a little confused by the voter ID conversation because our lawmakers consistently ask a lot of really good, tough questions about legislation. But for some reason, when it comes to voter ID, we sort of forget and we just kind of let it slide through because it's politically popular. Those questions that we're encouraging senators to ask are, number one, is there an actual problem that you're solving? And having a problem that you're solving doesn't mean that it intuitively sounds like there might be a problem. It means you have evidence to demonstrate that problem. And when it comes to voter impersonation fraud, that evidence is nowhere to be found. Secondly, senators often ask, will your legislation actually solve the problem that you've proposed? This is my personal biggest hang-up with voter ID, is that there is no evidence whatsoever to prove that voter ID either prevents fraud or even makes people feel better about fraud occurring in their state. So when you combine that with the fact that we have overwhelming qualitative evidence from across the country that voter ID laws do make the voting experience at least a little bit harder, and that impact disproportionately falls on three categories of people. First is people of color. Second is folks who live in rural parts of their state. And third is older people. There are thousands of Nebraskans who fall into each of those categories, each of whom could be seriously impacted by voter ID. And it would be one thing if we were having a rational policy discussion about weighing those consequences versus some really amazing benefits this bill could provide for us. But what we have is consequences and also no evidence that it does anything positive, which for us just kind of leaves us with an obvious no. One final note on voter ID laws is that they are going to be expensive. The Supreme Court has been very clear that in order for voter ID laws not to be a poll tax, the state has to pay for those IDs for people who need them. That means that this is not going to be free. For those of you who are comfortable advocating for legislation, you're probably familiar with the concept of a fiscal note. The Legislative Research Office basically gives a price tag to each piece of legislation. I like to flag this because legislative resolutions, so again, the LRCA part of this, means that we're not passing a bill. We are proposing to amend the Constitution, which means there's not actually a proposal to put a price tag on. So supporters of LR3CA might tell you that there's no price tag to this piece of legislation, but that's just deceitful because there is going to be a legislative bill that comes after. And the most recent evaluation by the Legislative Research Office says that that's going to cost at least $2.9 million in the first year of implementation and at least $750,000 afterwards. So it's not cheap. It's got no evidence that it does anything positive, and it also is going to have negative consequences on the voting experience for a lot of people. So those are the reasons we primarily oppose voter ID. I'll go ahead and pause here because this is an issue that is interesting to a lot of folks. Does anyone have any questions or comments or thoughts about this particular proposal before I move on? Margaret's got some great links to resources here, including the bill, some talking points, and some conversations surrounding ID in rural Nebraskans.
Is the document you're looking at there, is that something we can access? And if so, can someone put the link in the chat or something?
The link should be there in the chat at the beginning. Does everybody see it?
So I think I connected after you posted it, so therefore I don't see
Okay,
it.
I'll share it again.
Thank you.
So where is this now? I know a senator has brought this forward, but there are hundreds of proposals that have come forward. So where is it now, and what at this stage?
Yeah, sorry, Mark, I lost the last part of your question there. Were you saying something about the stage? And then your audio cut out there.
Mark, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I'll never get the hang of this. What I'm asking, where is it now, and what can we do at this stage to stifle this going forward any further?
Sure, great question. So this is a good chance to talk to you about the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee this session. That's the committee where most elections and kind of local government bills go. Voter ID has been assigned to the government committee already, as it always is. This is the second biennium in a row where there's I would say, a really hardline ideological split 4-4 in the 8-member government committee. In order for a proposal to advance, you're going to have 5 votes. And I say ideological because it actually is not partisan this year. Senator John McCollister is on the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee, I believe, for the first time ever. So I'll tell you that there are 5 Republicans, 3 Democrats. One of those Republicans is Senator McCollister. And then we have Senator Hunt, Senator Blood, and Senator Matt Hansen, all of whom are steadfast in their opposition to voter ID, which is great news. Senator McCollister has also been a very reliable opponent of voter ID. So what that means is that our job right now is to make sure that Senators Hunt, Blood, Matt Hansen, and McCollister just know that this is still a really, really important issue and that we need them to stay rock solid in their opposition to voter ID. If we can do that, then we are 99% sure that we're good to go. This will just languish in committee, which is exactly what should happen. There is another scenario in which we still have to have the broader discussion. And I think probably if that becomes relevant, Civic Nebraska will do our best to explain kind of this messy rules process. But there's kind of a trick by which a legislator can skip the committee process and kind of yank a bill onto the full floor. That requires a lot of votes, a lot of support. There's a lot of senators who might like voter ID, but just don't like that procedural trick to begin with. So if that happens, we'll be ready. But I would say that 99% of our job is making sure those 4 senators just know that we need them to stay rock solid in their opposition to voter ID. It's a great question.
Westin, is there a chance that SLAMA will make this a priority bill?
That is a great question. There's always a chance, yes. I'm trying to think. I think in her first session, her priority was the civics bill. So she's new enough that we don't really have a pattern for kind of what she likes to prioritize yet. Historically, the introducer of voter ID, this is a flashy enough issue that it's really interesting to prioritize for some folks. That being said, she also understands the reality that this really isn't going anywhere. So it doesn't usually behoove a senator to prioritize a bill that's not going to actually get passed. So I don't know at this point. The good news is that won't have a meaningful impact kind of on the trajectory of the bill. Because in the committee process, a priority just means we'd move the discussion to the top of the pile so that it didn't get kind of bogged down with other issues. But if the vote's 4-4, it'll be 4-4 no matter when we vote on it. So there is a chance, but thankfully would not have a big impact on the discussion this year. Any other voter ID questions? And we can always come back to it at the end. All right, let's move on. Okay, so we've got 2 bills that are about similar issues. So LR10CA, again, that constitutional amendment resolution, and LB158, just a legislative bill. These are two initiatives that are both about changing Nebraska's archaic felony disenfranchisement laws. LR10CA by Senator Michaela Cavanaugh is a proposed amendment that would pretty much do away with the notion of felony disenfranchisement from our Constitution. LB158 by Senator Justin Wayne would keep the concept in place, but would eliminate a really absurd additional restriction that Nebraska has in our system. So as quick context, states do felony disenfranchisement in a range of ways. On one end, we have Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia, who have no felony disenfranchisement at all. That means that even if you are convicted of a felony and you are serving prison time, you can still cast a ballot from prison. At the other end, we have, I believe, only 2 states left, which would be Virginia and I want to say Tennessee. I'm only 98% sure about that. That once you are convicted of a felony, you lose your right to vote forever unless you're pardoned by however your system is set up, the governor or the board of pardons, whatever. Then there's a bunch of states that are in between. Nebraska is one of only 4 states in the country that restricts the voting rights of all felony convictions for a period of time beyond their sentence. Even other states that are really strict, like Alabama, make some exceptions for certain felonies. Nebraska has a blanket rule in which if you're convicted, so let's say I'm convicted of a felony today, I lose my right to vote immediately. I can't vote in prison. I cannot vote for any duration of parole, probation. Once that's all done, once you're totally what's called off paper, there's then another 2 years where I still can't vote. And once the 2 years is up, then I can re-register. That is a 2-year waiting period that serves no meaningful policy purpose. Nebraska until 2005 was a lifetime ban state, and Senator Diana Shimmick led an effort to change the rules. The 2-year waiting period was what turned out to be an unnecessary negotiating tactic just to get the bill out of committee. And so it became law. That's the only purpose it serves. There's no actual policy justification for it. Civic Nebraska opposes the entire notion of felony disenfranchisement. We've supported Senator Wayne's bill for several years. The original version of LB 158 was introduced in 2017. Its number then was LB 75, exact same bill. That bill advanced from committee. It was passed by the legislature, but it was vetoed by Governor Ricketts. And then there were not the votes to override the veto. Since then, the looming veto has made this politically complicated, we'll say. And so Civic Nebraska has supported Senator Wayne in that effort since 2017. When Senator Michaela Cavanaugh introduced LR 10CA, or a similar version last year, we had to have a conversation about, okay, are we supporting just eliminating the 2-year waiting period? Is there a reason we would support that and not just getting rid of the entire notion of felony disenfranchisement? And our whole team got together and we just could not find a good reason that was rooted in Civic Nebraska's values for us to say, well, we like some felony disenfranchisement, but not all of it. The entire notion just runs contrary to the values that we hold as an organization. It's one of the most counterproductive policies that I deal with in the elections and voting rights world. There's a really common misconception, and this language was used in Governor Ricketts' veto letter too, that there's this notion that restricting voting rights during a prison sentence and once someone is out of prison, that somehow encourages good behavior and encourages folks to kind of earn their right to be full citizens. Preventing someone from participating in society, by definition, like that's an antisocial policy by definition. So we have a policy that is removing folks from society, and at the same time, we are demanding that they participate in society so that we know that they have the right to vote. Those two values are completely contradictory. We think this is, number one, just a fundamental issue of unfairness. We think that it's not at all absurd to say that at a bare minimum, if you've served your sentence, you should get to vote. We shouldn't tack on additional punishment once you've served your time. But we think the entire notion of felony disenfranchisement is, I don't know a better word than archaic. It's related to, the notion of civil death, which has existed since ancient Greece, which is the idea that certain crimes are bad enough that we can just take you out of society completely. It's worth noting that ancient Greece didn't have the notion of felony like we have today, where you have hundreds of crimes that are lumped under the same umbrella and treated all the same. I think this is a situation where our policy has failed to keep pace with the reality of our society, and we just can't find a good reason to support felony disenfranchisement. If folks are interested in reading our materials, we can always send things to you. Governor Ricketts' veto of LB 75 has kind of become the opposition talking points in the last few years. His talking points there were two parts. Number one, he said that proponents of, so Senator Wayne and supporters like Civic Nebraska, they said that we had failed to prove that having the right to vote encourages good behavior. Our argument against that is that opposition has a fundamental misunderstanding of what the right to vote is. The baseline status for an 18-year-old citizen in Nebraska is that you get to vote. That's not something to be earned. It's a right that needs to be furiously protected. So if the state is going to remove that right from you, which the court has decided in some cases we can do, if the state's going to take away that constitutional right, it's the state's responsibility to prove, number one, this is necessary, and number two, it's effective. And the state of Nebraska has just completely failed in that duty to prove that restricting this constitutional right is something that we need to do. The second opposition talking point is that LB 158 is unconstitutional. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply to LR 10CA because that would be amending the Constitution. LB 158 is changes a statute that's been in place since the beginning of, or since Nebraska first formalized its statute in 1875, I think. Governor Ricketts said this constitutes what's called a legislative pardon, which I would flag as not really a phrase. It was kind of invented for this veto letter. And he said that the legislature sort of is taking the job of the Board of Pardons by removing this 2-year waiting period. I would be happy to talk to you forever about why the analysis behind that is not sound. We think that it is a perfectly constitutionally legitimate responsibility of the legislature to determine when the right to vote is and should be restored. But again, the whole notion of felony disenfranchisement runs contrary to our values as an organization. I think, just to be candid, and both the introducers of these bills know this, LR10CA, Senator Kavanaugh's bill, is obviously the more, I don't like the word extreme because it's really not extreme, but the more sweeping version of this proposal. And so she knows that politically the body is still kind of grappling with this whole notion of, wait, we don't have to have felony disenfranchisement. Whereas LB 158, I think, in a world that doesn't have a looming veto, could be really politically viable. Similar story. This goes to the government committee, so this is a tough 4-4 conversation. I will tell you that in the past, I believe two members of the committee, Senator Brewer and Senator Lowe, voted the 2017 proposal out of committee, so they are not on principle opposed to this idea. But once the veto happened, a lot of folks started to change their tune. So yeah, I'll stop there. Any questions or thoughts or concerns about felony disenfranchisement as a whole, either of these proposals? That was a lot of words.
So this is the first time that the idea of just doing away with felon disenfranchisement in Nebraska has been floated, right?
This was brought up, I think Senator Kavanaugh is the first senator to actually propose it. The first time was actually 2 years ago. It was written in a way that she first did it as a legislative bill, and we said, hey, this probably needs to be an amendment. She was open to that feedback, and the next year brought it as an amendment. So last year it was LR 286 CA. This year it's LR 10, but same proposal.
So I noticed in the text of it that, or it looks to me like this means that felons could vote even in prison, for instance. Mm-hmm. Has there been opposition on those grounds, or?
Sure. I mean, this proposal is new enough that there was kind of a shocking lack of discussion about it in the government committee last time. It was the end of the year. People were kind of tired. Sort of just everyone's like, we know this isn't going anywhere. Let's kind of move on, which was a shame. Yes, there is opposition. It is not rooted in research or sound reasoning. And I don't mean this to sound flippant, but this really is, I think this responds accurately to the opposition. Maine and Vermont have allowed people to vote from prison for decades, and they have not turned into Gotham City. I think there's a misconception that, and I mean, I've heard this from folks, I will say, not in real life, but on Facebook, where you can sometimes find the more, I'll say, unfiltered input. I've gotten some messages from folks telling me that if we let prisoners vote, then they will start to elect their prisoner candidates who will enact their prisoner policies, and I'm pretty sure we'll have no more crimes. I don't think I need to explain why that's kind of messed up on a number of levels.
Fortunately, we don't have that many people in prison.
That would be the fundamental first problem. That's right, is that the voting block does not exist. Of course, then the notion that anyone convicted of a crime votes the same is absolutely absurd. So yes, there is opposition. It's not very reasonable, but I mean, but I also don't want to dismiss it, right? Because this is a newer idea. Only 2 states in DC have a no felony disenfranchisement policy. So this does invoke a lot of fear in people. Again, policymaking, especially when it comes to voting in elections, should not and cannot be based on fear. But I don't want to dismiss the reaction entirely. But that does show that we have a huge burden as voting rights advocates to do a lot of education on, number one, who is a prisoner in the first place, because it's not who opponents of this bill might have you think it is. And I mean, this is an issue that I think has just always been common sense to me, because I mean, and I think I'm willing to guess statistically, everyone on this call is at least related to one person who's been convicted of a felony. I have multiple relatives who have, and they are perfectly decent people who made a bad decision or two when they were younger. And it just is incomprehensible to me that would translate into you can't vote. It's just confusing. So yes, a lot of fear-based opposition, to which I think our only remedy is education at this point. All right, move on to a newer issue. So LB 577, this is a bill by Senator Bostar. For those of you not familiar with that name, this is Senator Bostar's first term in the legislature. He represents District 29, which was previously held by Senator Kate Bowles, who was term limited out. Senator Bostar has a really strong interest in elections and voting rights. We've had some great conversations about proposals he's interested in, and he's kind of packaged them all into one big bill, which is cool because it gives us a lot of good stuff to talk about. There are three major components to this bill. Number one, as you can see on the title there, is it would make Election Day a state holiday, and an official state holiday in the sense that most people should be getting the day off work. Also really an important symbolic celebration. It does two other things though that are about elections and not at all about the day itself. One is it enacts automatic voter registration, which is a term that many of you are familiar with. For those of you not, automatic voter registration is really kind of a misnomer. It becomes complicated to talk about, but all it does is it takes our current, we call motor voter process, which is your ability to register to vote at the DMV. Right now, the question on your form or on your digital pad will say, hey, you're giving us this information. Click yes if you'd like us to use this to register you to vote. You can say yes, great. All the automatic voter registration does is it changes the language of that question and says, hey, you're giving us a lot of information. We're going to use that to update your voter registration unless you click here and don't want us to do that. Awesome. That little language switch has a huge impact on the number of people who use this experience or this interaction, to update their voter registration or to create a new voter registration. Automatic voter registration is an issue that becomes confusingly political because this is an issue that, to me, is fundamentally about government efficiency. People are already at a government agency and they're already providing information. Why would we not use that information as efficiently as possible? So that is a component of LB 577. And then finally, on the early voting or vote by mail front, it also makes early voting or vote by mail ballots have prepaid postage, which is great. Obviously, it will not be cheap. This bill doesn't have a fiscal note yet, but it will be pretty significant between AVR. I don't know how they factor costs for holidays. We'll have to see. But prepaid postage, it'll be over $1 million for sure in terms of the fiscal note. This is a fundamental issue of, I think, customer service when it comes to running elections. Our state already provides prepaid postage on early voting request cards, but we don't do it for the envelope. The point I always try to make on this issue is, can most of us find a way to get a stamp to mail our ballot? Yes, or we can get in the car and go to a drop box. But you don't make good election policy based on what people can hopefully do. You make good election policy based on providing a consistent, uniform, reliable experience for voters, and that requires prepaid postage. This is an issue that I'll admit I was a little bit slow to pay attention to, but COVID made it pretty unavoidable because there were hundreds or thousands of people in Nebraska who during COVID were quarantined at home near election season without stamps in their house. What are those folks supposed to do? So we can see this is a real problem, and it's a problem that is worth solving. I'd love to answer any questions about any three of these pieces. Like I said, this will have a big fiscal note, which in terms of how much of this might get done this year, that the fiscal note will be an obstacle for sure. But I'm really optimistic about the Election Day holiday conversation. I have not yet talked to our Secretary of State about this issue, but our Secretary of State is a huge fan of the tradition of in-person voting. And so I'm really hopeful that kind of a state holiday to celebrate that tradition could be really interesting to him. But I will keep you all posted as that conversation progresses. Any questions about state holiday, automatic voter registration, prepaid ballots?
I have a question. If the fiscal note on this one is prohibitive in terms of eliminating support, would the sponsor take out that part and just go for the Election Day state holiday? Could they split out those issues?
They sure can. And I think Senator Bostar would be very open to that. Based on our conversations, I think that he just has a really, he's worked in kind of the policy world for a long time. I think his background is both in education and in environmental policy. And so he's pretty sturdy in his approach. He kind of knows the kind of senator he wants to be already. And he's very interested in saying, like, these are the policies we need to change, and I'm just going to keep introducing these bills because this is what needs to happen, which I think is great. But yes, practically, Janet, that's exactly right, is we'll introduce the proposal. And I'm sure that Senator Bostar, if there was support for one piece but not the other, I'm sure he'd be happy to split them out, and I would encourage him to do so.
Weston, I have a question or a comment, I guess, with the DMV automatic. As a person who's done a lot of voter registrations, when we ask students particularly, if they are already registered, they don't remember if they did that at the DMV. Yeah. Would there be some education piece to go along with it so that they understand what they're doing?
Absolutely. I think that would be essential. And that would be an important role both for the state and for organizations like Civic Nebraska to play if we were to implement a change like that. It's also a big reason I like the opt-in instead of the opt-out instead of the opt-in system. Because once you register to vote, you'll start to get contacted by your election commissioner. They will proactively reach out to you to confirm your address, make sure you have your voter identification number. So there's a number of contact steps that can happen to make sure you know you've registered. So I can't prove this with data, but intuitively, I would say most of those students who don't know probably haven't registered. And if we can switch that into an opt-out system where they're just kind of clicking the buttons and all of a sudden they're registered, that's great, because now we have additional context to go, oh, what's this green card? Oh, my voter registration, cool. The more touch points we can have, the better, I think, for that exact reason.
Thank you, that sounds great.
Any other questions on 577? I should tell you too, the committee's system this year is a little bit different with COVID. They are doing all-day hearings. I don't know for how long, but at least for the next several weeks. The legislative body is not even having floor discussions right now. They're just in committee hearings all day long. So they're trying to fly through these things so that then senators and staff can kind of measure their time on the floor and socially distance as best they can. Some of these bills have been scheduled for hearings, but the majority of the election bills have not been. I would imagine there's going to be 1, maybe 2 days where just every election bill is all on the same day. So if you need to find me, I'll be in the Capitol with a mask on. But if you're interested in kind of keeping track of that timeline, we will certainly, I'm assuming all of you are getting the Civic Nebraska communications, and we will certainly keep you updated. But I'd imagine we're getting ready for 1 or 2 very busy days in February or early March. Ah, yes, a small issue, redistricting. All right, so LB 107 is a bill by Senator John McCollister, who has a strong interest in redistricting. In the last 2 years, there have been several redistricting proposals ranging from rules changes to establishing an independent commission to trying to legislate rules for senators to follow as they draw the maps. This year, LB 107 is it. It's the only redistricting proposal that we have. I will do my best. I'm going to give myself 1.5 minutes to explain this redistricting process and not assume yet that we're all on the same page. So I'm sure Brad's going to time me. So start the clock. Redistricting is a process that happens every 10 years. State legislatures are responsible with new census data to redraw legislative maps on the county, the city, or the state, and the congressional level. The way Nebraska draws their maps right now is that the legislature draws them. There's a committee of 9 people who are selected by the exec board. Those 9 people create a map in the form of a legislative bill, and the body has to adopt that map. There's a couple basic rules. You can't break up counties unless you absolutely have to. Let's reverse that. If a county is large enough to be its own district, then it has to be. Madison County was kind of a dramatic example, I think 10 or 20 years ago, where they said, you can't break us up because we have enough people who live here. And there's a couple basic rules that 10 years ago, the legislature passed to govern their map drawing process. 10 years ago, the legislature said we can't look at political data, so we don't know voter registration numbers. We can't look at demographic data beyond just like population numbers. Ooh, that might have been it, actually. And then we have some rules about county lines. And then all districts have to be contiguous. You can't have 2 islands that are connected and say that that's District 21 or whatever. the rules that we passed 10 years ago only applied to the map drawing process 10 years ago. We need to pass new rules to govern this year's redistricting process. LB 107 would provide some basic rules. For those of you who follow redistricting, you will, depending on your beliefs, be happy or disappointed to know that this is not a bill about an independent commission. It was just decided that is just not politically realistic. There was an extremely bipartisan proposal in 2016. Senators Moranti and Mello came together and formed a proposal to establish a commission. The governor said no way, and there weren't the votes to override it. So the legislature will be drawing their maps. There's no way around it. LB 107 provides some basic rules. They're not so different from what I described happening 10 years ago. Off the top of my head, it doesn't allow looking at political data. It doesn't allow looking at demographic data beyond just population numbers. I'll have to check. There's a couple more details. Senator McAllister has been putting in a lot of work to find a proposal that is meaningful, but also politically viable. Redistricting, I will admit to all of you, is all of my colleagues know this. Redistricting is my least favorite issue to work on, not because it's not important, but because it is inherently a partisan activity. There is no nonpartisan version of redistricting. It's two parties negotiating about maps. Our job is to encourage them to follow rules that are at least somewhat objective and not clearly about manipulating maps in an unfair way. The Redistricting Committee was just announced within the last 24 hours. It includes Senator Moorfield, who's the founder of Civic Nebraska, but it's 5 Republicans, 4 Democrats, all folks who are, I think, ready to take this process very, very seriously. And we will do our best to keep you posted as the process moves forward. Let me pause there and just see if folks have questions about redistricting. I find this is an issue that some voting rights advocates are like, I don't care about this, and some have tons of interest. So I would love to talk either way. All right. Well, we will keep you updated. One other thing to note is many of you might know that, especially because of COVID, the timeline for our census data is totally out of control. Normal process. So 10 years ago, our legislative sessions are always the same kind of calendar timeline. I think the goal was to have maps drawn by March and approved well before the end of the session. Because of COVID, we're not going to have updated census state level data until June, which is when we should be adjourning. I don't know yet if that means that the legislature will either do their best and go back and revise, or there's a very real possibility that redistricting might be held for a special session. It's one of the few issues that we can pretty much promise a special session because it's one of, I think, only 2 duties that the legislature is constitutionally mandated to do, which is pass a budget and every 10 years do redistricting. So it will happen. It's just a question of if it happens early on. I don't know enough about census data to tell you basically how much guesswork they're allowed to do ahead of time, or if they just have to wait till they have the new data. So we will do our best to keep you updated on that as it moves forward. Oh yes, the quirkiest issue. All right, so next we have LR 14, which is, this is a resolution to sign Nebraska onto a call for an Article 5 Convention of States or an Article 5 Constitutional Convention. A proponent of this bill would yell at me for calling it a constitutional convention. We'll talk in a minute why that's maybe a bit of an overreaction. So Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution provides 2 ways to amend the U.S. Constitution. Method number 1 is how we have always done it, which is Congress, much like at the legislative level for Nebraska, Congress passes the amendment, it goes to the states, and the 3/4 of the states have to ratify, and then the Constitution is amended. That's how we've always done it. There's another way, which is untested, and that is the Article 5 Convention way. So in an Article 5 Convention, if the legislatures in 2/3 of the states pass a similar resolution that says, we want a convention, we're going to go, once that threshold is met, Congress will convene an Article 5 Convention, which is where every state will send delegates. How many? Good question. Those delegates will get together and they will propose amendments to the Constitution. How will they do that? What are the rules? All excellent questions. Once they decide on amendments and they figure out how they're going to vote them out, then states have to ratify, just like the old method. There are two politically different movements towards this Article 5 convention. The movement on the left, and this comes primarily from the Wolf Pack, which is a George Soros kind of political action committee. The Wolf Pack wants to call an Article 5 convention to overturn Citizens United. That is their clearly stated purpose. On the right, there's a movement called Convention. Oh, I'm blanking on their name. I think Convention of States is the name of the organization. Mark Meckler, who is the actual founder of the Tea Party, his next project was an organization called Convention of States, and they want to pass resolutions like LR 14. So Senator Halloran has great relationships with the Convention of States folks. LR 14 is going to sign Nebraska onto a constitution, or to a constitutional convention for the purpose of, let's see, there's three. Let's see if I can remember them. Establish term limits on Congress, regulate federal spending, and limit the size and scope of the federal government. Now, so that's the purpose for which we'd be calling this convention. Now, proponents of a convention will tell you that you have nothing to be worried about, because if a delegate tries to do something outside of that scope, which they tell you is limited, then they could be recalled, and they're not just gonna, they'll tell you they're not gonna rewrite the Constitution. They're going for a very limited purpose. There's another bill, I don't remember the number, but there's another bill, it's called the Faithful Delegate Bill. And it's a bill that promises that if we sign on to this, we promise our delegates won't get out of line or go outside of this scope. And if they do, we'll bring them home. My question I would pose to you, and the question I will pose to all the senators, is can you think of a change to the government, just as broadly as possible, that does not fall into the categories of term limits, limiting spending, or limiting the size and scope of the federal government? I would argue that those three tenets encompass any change you would ever possibly make to our governmental structure. There's nothing at all limited about this scope. As a voting rights organization, well, first let me tell you that they have, in 2016, there was kind of a test run of this event. They literally held, it was called a mock convention. I think it was in Texas, or at least, I don't know, Governor Abbott got very excited about it. I think it was in Texas. They had a mock convention to see what kind of proposals might come out of a convention like this. Nebraska sent, I think, Senator, at the time, Senator Ebke and Senator Hilkeman, maybe? I can't remember. Anyway, there's a mock convention, and the proposals that came out of that were things to the effect of the House of Representatives by majority vote can eliminate a federal agency, and states can overturn federal regulations by a X threshold of votes. It was concerning. There was definitely a balanced budget amendment passed. So I'll tell you that as a voting rights organization, like a lot of folks ask, like, why does Civic Nebraska work on this? What's the connection? We do value the United States Constitution very dearly. I'll tell you, as a voting rights organization, though, our primary concern is that any proposal, any realistic simulation of this convention puts the Department of Justice at risk. And the Department of Justice is, at least in theory, voters' last line of defense against a state infringement of voting rights. The folks who typically call for Article 5 conventions were not too concerned about Shelby v. Holder. They don't find the Voting Rights Act to be particularly modern, relevant legislation. We can be pretty confident that preserving the Department of Justice, particularly the Civil Rights, Voting Rights Division, would not be a huge priority for any realistic version of this convention. And we just don't think that risk is worth it. As people who just live here, aside from our day jobs, we are opposed to this issue because an Article 5 convention would absolutely result in a balanced budget amendment, which would destroy Nebraska's budget. The premise of a convention of states is that Congress is too greedy and too spendy to regulate itself in the first place. Okay, not a totally absurd premise, right? But if we go to this convention, we pass a balanced budget amendment, there's no way that a convention could write a balanced budget amendment that also prescribes the cuts that have to be made to balance the budget, right? They just say, hey, Congress, you have to balance the budget. If Congress is so greedy and we make them balance the budget, what in the world makes us think they will start to regulate their own swollen federal spending? The very first thing that will be chopped is federal aid to the states. And in 2018, 37% of Nebraska's budget came from the federal government. That money is gone in an Article 5 convention world. That's money for schools, that's money for infrastructure, that's money for farmers. I've found it desperately confusing that Senator Halloran is both the proponent of an Article 5 convention and the chair of the Agriculture Committee, because I guarantee you this result would be dreadful for Nebraska farmers, who the last numbers I know are 2017, when we received Nebraska farmers received $750 million in federal subsidies. We can absolutely kiss that money goodbye in a world in which an Article 5 convention passes a balanced budget amendment. So that's a lot of reasons, some of which are directly about voting rights, some of which I think are just common sense red flags. This is a pretty quirky issue. So if any folks have concerns or questions, I would be happy to chat about them. All right.
I'm sorry to jump in again.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking that they are pretty close to their 2/3, aren't they? And if Nebraska were to go with it, it would get them very close.
So to show how absurd this all is, I don't even know how to answer that question, because some people say, yes, we're very close, because we can identify calls for conventions since 1780, whatever, including Nebraska. Back in the 60s or 70s, Nebraska called for a convention. It wasn't the same language, but it was a call for a convention. Does that count? Does the sign-on from Virginia from 1872, does that count? I don't know. It's totally unclear how we decide this. I think that the reasonable thing to do is for this to only count if every state can pass the exact same proposal. And that's what, like, the Convention of States folks and the Wolfpack folks, they are just offering copy and pasted legislation to every state, which in this case is a pretty good idea, just so we're all exactly on the same page. There is another bill. I'm gonna have to look up the number. But Senator, is it Hilkeman again this year? John or Brad, do you know that off the top of your head? I think it's Hilkeman. There is a bill to, just for that very reason, to avoid confusion, to rescind all of Nebraska's previous calls to a convention, just so that we can have a clean slate and at least know what we're signing up for, because we're not even there yet.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
I was worried that we were going to tilt the balance.
So, and again, there's some math that tells us we're within one or two states. And again, there's some folks who say, no, it's got to be the same language, in which case we've only got, 8 or 9. So
okay,
it's all very unclear. All right, so those are the big highlights. We've got some more bills here that Margaret has listed. There's a hearing tomorrow for LB 83, which is a bill by Senator Flood, who's back in the legislature representing Madison County. This is a bill that would expand local government's ability to hold video conferences, including public participation in those conferences, which especially in a time of COVID is so important. There's a couple bills about the single subject rule for ballot initiatives. If any of you are familiar with or worked on the medical marijuana ballot initiative last year, you know that they had their hearts broken by the court, who said that you violated the single subject rule, therefore your petition is invalidated. Senator Wishart and Senator Bostar both have some proposals to at least try to provide some clarity so that folks know what they're getting into before they spend a lot of their time and money on these initiatives. LB 635 is a bill by Senator John Kavanaugh, again in his first term in the legislature. He has an interest in nonpartisan elections. So LB 635, it wouldn't actually, to my best my understanding, he wouldn't actually change the structure of elections, but he wants to at least remove kind of that R&D designation from the actual ballot to at least make folks not reflex vote based on party, but actually think about candidates. And Civic Nebraska supports pretty much anything that encourages nonpartisan elections. We would like to see every office elected in the same way the legislature is. LB 285, really simple mechanical bill. This is a bill that is going to allow Nebraska to join a national data sharing organization that will really improve our voter registration system. LB 285 was just kind of an administrative fix we had to make sure that the data stayed private when we start to share information with other states to update our system. LB 8 by Senator Blood provides a definition of the phrase electioneering communication, which is a really important first step to having more serious conversations about political spending. I like to make fun of myself because my first year at Civic Nebraska, I got really excited about having some conversations about money in politics and trying to figure out how Nebraska can start to regulate obscene political spending. And so I did a bunch of research and I scheduled a meeting with Frank Daly, who's the director of the Nebraska Accountability and Disclosure Commission. And I sat him down and I said, Frank, I got all these great ideas. And he said, kid, this is really cool, but I got to tell you, we don't even have a definition of what electioneering communication is in state law. So maybe let's start there. And I was like, yeah, yes, sir. Great. Awesome. So Senator Blood is going to do that. Senator Crawford was previously the senator who would try to get this established. Senator Hilders last year did get a bill passed that defined electioneering, but that was in the context of a polling place, not political and partisan spending. So Senator Blood wants to talk about it in the sense of campaigning. LB 11 is a pretty large bill by Senator Blood. She's got a couple good changes that have to do with early voting. She wants to establish a permanent early voting list for all counties. She wants to require notification if your ballot request is rejected. There's one other piece that I'm blanking on. You click on the link and find out. Margaret's included the link. And then LB 435 is a bit of a mystery bill to us still. I'm trying to get a hold of Senator Ben Hansen. I'm having a hard time getting in touch with him. It would require the Secretary of State to put watermarks on our ballots. My only context for this, and this is from other folks who work on election stuff, is that apparently in kind of the last couple months of Trump mania when it comes to voter fraud and early voting, one of the conversations that kind of inexplicably happened is it was either President Trump or part of his team made the claim that in order to prove that fraud existed, we were going to secretly watermark a bunch of ballots so that we'd know which ones were real and which ones were fake. I don't know anything about this conversation beyond that. Our Secretary of State's office was not familiar with this issue. So we are all trying to figure out what is going on. So we'll keep you posted. It's a process that I imagine would have a pretty hefty price tag as well. So probably just an interesting conversation starter at this point. 3 more bills that we are opposing. LB 195, there we go. That's the faithful delegate bill. So that's the companion to LR 14, the Convention of States bill. Again, there's no way to talk about them separately. LB 195 exists to make LR 14 more likely to pass. Therefore, we oppose them both. LB 362 is a bill by Senator Halloran that restricts third-party ballot collection. So Nebraska actually has very few rules right now governing the return of ballots. We have some rules for requesting. So let's say if you're prohibited by schedule, if you are homebound, you can designate an agent to request your ballot for you and have it delivered to your house. And there are limitations for who can do that and how many people they can do it for. Those limitations do not exist for ballot returns. So organizations like Civic Nebraska, ARC of Nebraska, some political parties, a part of their kind of campaign efforts toward the end is to help people return their ballots. Because if you don't live near a drop box or you don't have stamps or whatever, the important thing is to get the ballot returned. Senator Halloran wants to put the same restrictions on ballot returns as we have on ballot requests. We oppose this bill for the primary reason that, well, 2 reasons. Number one, there are going to be costs and consequences to that will make it harder for folks to return their ballot. And there just we haven't seen a useful conversation as to how we're going to compensate for that cost yet. If we're going to restrict this tool, we need to have a better tool to take its place. The second reason we oppose LB 362 is that we think we can solve the same problem without the costs using a different strategy. So our alternative solution to LB 362 is for Nebraska to invest heavily in it. Well, not heavily, it's pretty affordable actually, to invest seriously in its improved ballot tracking system. There are states and cities throughout the country that integrate their vote by mail ballots with USPS ballot or smart tracking technology. So you can track your ballot like you track a package. You can get notifications when your ballot is mailed to you, when it should have arrived, when they've received it back, and most importantly, when it's counted, or if it's rejected, you'll get an alert saying, whoops, your ballot was rejected. Here are some instructions if this was a mistake, because you probably just forgot to sign your ballot. Here are some instructions for how to get that solved. The primary security concern behind LB 362 is we can lose track of ballots, and that's a problem. And Civic Nebraska agrees. We would like to avoid that problem, but we think there's a better solution, and that's just to know how to actually track the ballots, not restrict tools that are pretty useful. Per state, this is different, but I know in Nebraska, one of the largest populations that uses this tool is folks with physical disabilities who can't leave their home very easily. And so having folks come and grab that ballot can be really useful. LB 590 is a bill by Senator Groney. Basically, there's a timeline in statute for early ballots, including how early you can request and how late you have to return them. He shrinks that timeline in both directions. So you can't get the ballot as early, you can't return it as late. As you've probably caught on by now, if we're going to restrict the voting process in any way, I really need to see a strong justification for why you're doing it and whether it's going to be actually effective. This bill kind of came out of left field for us. So we're of course happy to talk with Senator Groney about it, but notwithstanding the justification for why, this is just not a bill we can support. Okay, that is the summary, the not so short summary of the election and voting rights bills in the legislature. As I mentioned, the 4-4 kind of ideological split in the committee means that very few of these proposals will advance from committee, which in a stressful year, in a world of COVID, I'm not super upset about, if I'm being totally honest with you. I think that's a safe place to be. That being said, there are a lot of really important proactive proposals. I didn't mean for that to be such an alliteration. In front of the legislature this year. Obviously, I want to know what's most interesting to you. I can tell you from a personal level, LB 158 by Senator Wayne is the bill for me that I know it's supposed to be 4-4, but I don't care. I'm still going to call my senators and beg them to get this out of committee because it's such an important proposal. It's such an important issue, and we can't let the legislature forget that these issues really are important to us. With that, that's all I've got for you. I would love to answer any lingering questions, concerns. If not, Margaret and Mike and Brad and John, I know have a ton of resources to send you. And of course, you're all connected with our VRA emails. So we'll do our best to keep in touch.
Yeah, I'll keep updating this. If we get more materials, I'll throw them into this slideshow, so it'll be updated throughout the session. So, and you should have the ability to comment on the links that come through Civic Nebraska. So if you have any questions, you can throw them in there. Or if you come across some resource that was really beneficial to you and you think we should include it, you can include it in those comments on the links as well. There was just one little feature that is new this year that Wes made me aware of is you can now submit your written comment right on the bills themselves, on some of them. So it has a little link there. So you can just click on that link and you can post your written comment right in there. And I think that's super cool. So I just wanted to make sure you were all aware that that's a thing now. So
absolutely. And I would maybe flag that tool is going to be especially important for the senator that actually represents you. So the two things to know about this are that these comments will not become a part of the public record for this bill, but from the back end, so from the senator's perspective, these comments will basically come in the form of a spreadsheet, which they will sort by bill and by district. So Senator McAllister is going to go through and see, okay, who commented on LR 14 and who of those commenters is from my district. And you better believe they're going to read those comments. So definitely encourage folks to comment, with messages to their senator. Very important.
Is that a better way of communicating with them than sending emails to their legislative addresses?
I wouldn't do this instead of an email. I think both
Okay.
is probably pretty important.
Okay.
It unfortunately really depends on the senator whether or not we know for sure they read it or if it kind of gets screened through the staff. I will tell you that the overwhelming majority of senators read everything that actually comes from their constituents in their district. It seems like with every passing year, they get more and more kind of spam copy and paste messages from bots or whoever. But if it's clearly from your district or from their district, they will definitely read your email.
What's the best way for us to identify ourselves as a member of their district in that case? Because I mean, it's not like you can tell from the email address.
Right. No, I would lead with it. I would say, my name is so-and-so. I live in District 21. You don't need to give your address or anything. I feel like that kind of used to be a habit. Folks would give their address. If you want to, great, but you certainly don't have to. Some senators still are pretty old school and like might write you a little thank you note for reaching out, especially if you write a letter to them. But in general, I would just lead with, my name is Matt. I live in District 27. I want to talk to you about LB 21. That'll get their attention for sure.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all for joining us tonight, and go team.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your work on this. Thanks for your interest.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.